Story 1: The Haunted Hotel in Kashmir. The night was unnervingly still as Hassan and Shamu, two cousins on their way to a family wedding, found themselves lost on an unfamiliar mountain road. The GPS had failed. The signal was gone. And the dense forest surrounding them seemed to close in tighter with every passing mile. Just as they began to panic, the faint glimmer of lights appeared in the distance. It was a small, decrepit building perched precariously on the edge of a dark cliffside, a hotel. "Finally," Shamu said, his voice breaking the tense silence. But as the car crept closer, an uneasy feeling settled in their stomachs. The sign overhead, swinging weakly in the cold wind, read Mountain Edge Hotel. What seemed like a beacon of hope became a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. The Mountain Edge Hotel was nothing like the cozy inns they'd imagined. Its walls were cracked, the paint peeling, and the flickering neon sign cast an eerie glow. The forest beyond loomed like a silent sentinel, dark and impenetrable. The air was colder than it should have been. And as they stepped into the dimly lit lobby, the overwhelming scent of mildew assaulted their senses. The lobby was nearly empty, save for an old, dust-covered reception desk and a single chair by the corner. A figure sat there, motionless, a man who seemed to have aged with the building. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his clothes faded as if he had been waiting for decades. Without a word, the receptionist handed them a room key. "Room 106. Where is everyone?" Hassan whispered to Shamu. But his cousin only shrugged, clutching the key tightly. The walk to their room was unnerving. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, with dim sconces casting distorted shadows on the walls. Each step echoed louder than it should have, and the oppressive silence seemed alive. Their room was no better. The air was damp. The bed creaked ominously, and the window offered a view of absolute darkness. Exhausted from the journey, they tried to dismiss their unease. But as night deepened, things began to change. It started with whispers, faint and unintelligible, but persistent. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, as if someone were pacing just outside their door. "Do you hear that?" Hassan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shamu nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just the wind." But when the doorknob began to rattle, they both froze. Gathering his courage, Hassan flung the door open. The hallway was empty. The unease escalated into dread when Shamu spotted a shadowy figure standing at the end of the corridor. It didn't move. And when Hassan turned to look, it was gone. Their nerves were fraying, but they convinced themselves to stay until morning. The whispers seemed to seep from the walls themselves, growing louder and more distinct. Words emerged from the incoherent murmurs, though not in a language either cousin could understand. The room's dim light flickered violently, plunging them into alternating moments of suffocating darkness and harsh, cold illumination. Hassan sat rigidly on the bed, clutching his knees. "I feel like something's watching us," he muttered, barely audible over the growing whispers. Shamu, pacing near the door, froze mid-step. "Do you feel that?" he asked. His breath puffed visibly in the freezing air. "It's cold. But not just cold. It feels wrong." The air grew oppressive, pressing down on them like invisible hands. Then came the tapping again. This time not from the window but from the wardrobe in the corner of the room. 3 sharp knocks, deliberate and steady. "Don't open it." Hassan blurted, his voice trembling. I wasn't planning to. Shamu replied, taking a cautious step back. But the knocking continued. More insistent now. As if whatever was inside the wardrobe wanted desperately to come out. Then came the laughter. Faint at first. Like the giggle of a child. It seemed to echo in the room. Bouncing off the walls. Growing louder until it filled their ears. Shamu grabbed his flashlight and directed it toward the wardrobe. His hands shaking. What if? He hesitated. Glancing at Hassan. Don't even say it. Hassan snapped. His fear spilling into anger. The laughter stopped abruptly. Plunging the room into an even more unsettling silence. The cousins exchanged a glance. Their breaths shallow. Suddenly, the bulb above them exploded, plunging the room into total darkness. Shamu fumbled for the flashlight. But before he could turn it back on, a loud thud shook the room. What was that? Hassan whispered, gripping the edge of the bed. It came from the wardrobe. Shamu replied, his voice barely audible. The door to the wardrobe creaked open just a fraction, revealing nothing but blackness within. Yet, both cousins felt it, an icy breath spilling out of the gap, brushing against their faces. As they backed away from the wardrobe, the window began to rattle violently, as if something outside was trying to break in. The fog outside seemed alive, swirling and coalescing into shapes. For a fleeting moment, Hassan thought he saw a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Then came the scratching. Slow, deliberate, and unbearably loud. It scraped along the walls, circling the room. Shamu grabbed Hassan's arm. We need to get out of here. Now. Just as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The whispers returned, louder this time, and now accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Hassan stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. We're not alone in here, he choked out. Their flashlights provided little comfort. The beams seemed swallowed by the darkness, revealing only fleeting glimpses of the room. A shadow moved across the far wall, larger than anything that should have been there. Did you see that? Shamu hissed, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Before Hassan could respond, the shadow darted across the room, disappearing into the wardrobe. The door slammed shut again, this time with such force that the entire room seemed to shake. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing, echoing with a mocking tone. And then, in the faint light of the flashlight, they saw it, handprints appearing on the walls. Dozens of them, pressing outward as if something was trying to escape. Shamu began reciting prayers under his breath, his voice quivering. But the whispers grew louder, drowning out his words. The cousins backed into the corner of the room, their flashlights flickering. Hassan's heart pounded in his chest as the air seemed to thicken around them. He felt it before he saw it, a presence in the room. The shadows coalesced into a vaguely human shape near the wardrobe. Its form was fluid, shifting between shapes as if struggling to maintain a physical form. When it finally solidified, its face was a grotesque amalgamation of features, eyes sunken and empty, mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It stepped forward, silent but deliberate, and the temperature plummeted further. Hassan felt his breath hitch as his body froze in place, paralyzed by fear. Get out! Shamu shouted, breaking the silence. He threw the flashlight toward the figure. But it passed through as if the entity was made of smoke. The creature tilted its head unnaturally, as if studying them, before disappearing into the shadows again. For a moment, there was silence. Then the wardrobe door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that shattered the mirror beside it. "We have to leave now," Shamu screamed, dragging Hassan toward the door. The air in the room had grown thick, almost suffocating. Every breath felt like a struggle, as if invisible hands were wrapping around their throats. The whispers had transformed into a guttural cacophony, voices layering over each other in a sinister chant. The walls seemed alive, pulsing and shifting as shadowy shapes moved within them. "Run!" Shamu croaked, his voice barely audible over the deafening noise. They bolted toward the door. But as Hassan's hand gripped the doorknob, it burned like fire. He yelped, pulling his hand back to reveal angry red welts forming on his palm. The whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking. The room's light flickered, and for a split second, they saw it again, the figure from the wardrobe. This time, it was closer. Its grotesque face twisted into an unnatural grin. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through them, as if staring directly into their souls. "We're not getting out of here alive," Hassan muttered, panic lacing his voice. "Yes, we are," Shamu snapped, grabbing the chair near the desk and hurling it at the entity. The chair shattered against the wall, and the figure vanished into a cloud of dark mist. But the room wasn't done with them. The floorboards beneath them began to groan and splinter. A deep rumble resonated from below, and the once sturdy wood started to crack. Shamu lunged for Hassan, pulling him back just as a large section of the floor collapsed, revealing an abyss of writhing shadows below. From the void, hands, elongated and bony, reached upward, clawing at the edges of the floor as if trying to pull themselves free. "We have to go," Shamu shouted, dragging Hassan toward the hallway. The door flew open on its own, revealing the long corridor, now bathed in an eerie, blood-red light. Shadows darted along the walls, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and blank faces. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, advancing toward the cousins with each flicker of the light. Hassan and Shamu sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The shadows chased them, their movements growing faster and more erratic. Doors along the hallway began to slam open and shut violently, revealing fleeting glimpses of otherworldly scenes, empty rooms filled with floating objects, figures standing motionless in the corners, and walls dripping with a dark, tar-like substance. As they reached the lobby, they skidded to a halt. The receptionist stood in the center of the room, his back to them. His head was tilted at an impossible angle, and his shoulders twitched unnaturally. "Why leave so soon?" he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. He turned slowly, and the cousins gasped. His face was no longer human. The skin had peeled away, revealing a hollow skull-like visage with deep, glowing red sockets where his eyes should have been. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. "You're not welcome here," the figure hissed, though his tone was mocking. "But you're also not free to leave." Hassan's knees buckled, but Shamu yanked him upright. "We're leaving," Shamu said, his voice trembling but firm. The receptionist raised a skeletal hand, and the walls of the lobby began to tremble. The chandelier overhead crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Shadows spilled from every corner, converging into a swirling mass that began to take shape, a towering figure with glowing red eyes and clawed hands. The cousins bolted for the door, dodging falling debris and claw-like shadows that lashed out at them. The floor beneath their feet cracked and buckled, forcing them to leap over gaps that revealed the same dark abyss they had seen in their room. As they reached the exit, the towering figure lunged, its clawed hand slashing through the air just inches from Hassan's back. They crashed through the front door and into the freezing night. But the chaos didn't stop. The parking lot was no longer as they had left it. The car was surrounded by shadows that writhed and twisted, blocking their path. "What now?" Hassan gasped, his breath visible in the icy air. "Keep moving," Shamu shouted, grabbing a nearby rock and hurling it at the shadows. The figures recoiled slightly, creating a narrow path to the car. They sprinted forward, yanking open the car doors and throwing themselves inside. The shadows surged forward, slamming against the windows and rocking the car violently. Hassan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely insert them into the ignition. "Come on! Come on!" Shamu yelled, banging on the dashboard. The engine roared to life, and Hassan floored the accelerator. The car lurched forward, plowing through the mass of shadows. A deafening screech filled the air as the figures clawed at the car. But the cousins didn't stop. As they sped down the mountain road, the hotel loomed behind them, its lights flickering wildly. For a brief moment, they thought they were safe. But then the shadows began to spill from the hotel, chasing them down the narrow path. "Faster!" Shamu shouted, gripping the dashboard. The shadows grew closer, their forms stretching unnaturally, as if the distance meant nothing to them. One lashed out, striking the car and shattering the rear window. Hassan swerved, narrowly avoiding the edge of the cliff. "We're not going to make it," Hassan muttered, panic rising in his voice. "Yes, we are," Shamu snapped. "Just keep driving." As they rounded a sharp curve, a blinding light erupted behind them. They glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the hotel engulfed in flames, the shadows writhing and screaming as they were consumed. The road ahead was clear now, and the cousins didn't stop until they reached the highway. Bursting out into the cold night, they threw themselves into their car. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the mountain road without looking back. It was only when they reached the main highway that they dared to breathe again. "Did we just survive that?" Shamu asked, his voice trembling. Hassan didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror. The Mountain Edge Hotel was gone, swallowed by the darkness, as if it had never been there. Even days later, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Dreams were plagued by whispers, and every shadow seemed to hold the memory of that cursed night. What would you have done in their place? Would you have stayed the night? Or would you have left as soon as you felt something was wrong? Let us know in the comments below. Story 2, A Ghostly Encounter in Murray. It began as the perfect escape, a road trip to Murray, Pakistan's picturesque hill station, where misty mountains kissed the sky. 4 friends, Ramesh, Awais, Ali, and the protagonist, reveled in the thrill of the open road, the promise of adventure ahead. Laughter filled the crisp morning air as they rode their motorcycles up the winding trails, stopping for selfies and soaking in the serene beauty of the hills. But as the sun dipped behind the peaks and rain clouds rolled in, their carefree journey took a sinister turn. Trapped in a remote hotel under a relentless downpour, they began to notice things they couldn't explain: whispers in the darkness, fleeting shadows, and a voice calling from the storm. What started as an adventure quickly turned into a confrontation with the unknown. The group arrived at the hotel just as the rain began, its heavy droplets pounding on their helmets like an urgent warning. The building, tucked away at the edge of the forest, looked unassuming but weathered, its wooden facade chipped and its windows fogged. The signboard overhead read Hillcrest Lodge, though the words were barely legible under a thin layer of grime. They parked their motorcycles and dashed inside, greeted by a musty scent that hinted at years of neglect. The lobby was dimly lit, with an old receptionist who barely looked up as he handed them a single key. "You're the only guests tonight," he muttered, his voice raspy. The room itself was simple but functional: a double bed, a worn sofa, and a creaky wooden wardrobe. From their window, they could see the dense forest that stretched into the horizon, its tall trees swaying under the storm's fury. "This place is kind of creepy," Ali joked. But his laugh lacked its usual warmth. "Relax," Ramesh said, plopping onto the bed. "It's just the rain. Once it clears, this will feel like paradise." But the rain didn't clear. As night fell, the storm intensified, and with it came an unsettling quiet inside the hotel. The friends spent the evening playing cards and sharing stories, trying to drown out the storm's roar. Around midnight, a loud knock startled them. "Who could that be?" Awais asked, glancing at the door. Ramesh opened it cautiously, but no one was there. He looked down the hallway, which was empty save for flickering sconces. Shrugging, he shut the door. Moments later, the knock came again, louder this time. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Is someone messing with us?" Ali asked. The knocking stopped, but a new sound replaced it, a faint tapping against the window. The protagonist turned toward it and froze. "What is it?" Awais asked, but his voice seemed distant. "There's someone outside," the protagonist whispered, pointing at the glass. They all turned to look, but the fog made it hard to see anything clearly. For a fleeting moment, a shadowy figure appeared, then vanished as quickly as it had come. "Must be a branch," Ramesh said, though his tone was less confident now. The night stretched on, and the air inside the room grew colder, almost icy. The knocking returned, this time on the wardrobe. "Enough of this," Awais said, standing up. He opened the wardrobe, revealing nothing but empty wooden shelves. Yet, the cold seemed to pour out, wrapping around them like an invisible fog. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic pounding of rain against the windows. The four friends sat in uneasy silence, the earlier joviality completely drained from the air. Shadows flickered along the walls, shaped by the dim, unreliable light of the overhead bulb. "I'm telling you, something's not right here," the protagonist said, his voice low but insistent. That knock on the wardrobe, it wasn't just random. Before anyone could respond, the bulb flickered again, bathing the room in a strobe-like effect. For a split second, the protagonist thought he saw something, a figure standing by the door. He blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Ramesh asked. though his tone betrayed his own unease. The protagonist shook his head. Never mind. As they sat there, trying to distract themselves with small talk, a loud knock shattered the silence once more. This time, it was not on the wardrobe but on the door to their room. Ramesh stood, his movements hesitant. "I'll check," he said, though the tremor in his voice was evident. "Wait," the protagonist said, standing as well. "Don't open it yet." He approached the door cautiously, pressing his ear to it. There was nothing, no shuffling of feet, no breathing, just silence. Against his better judgment, he twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The flickering sconces cast long, distorted shadows, and the air felt colder than before. But standing at the far end of the hallway was the old man they had seen earlier. "You shouldn't be here," the old man rasped, his voice carrying unnaturally far. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through them. "They don't like visitors." "Who doesn't like visitors?" Ramesh asked. But the old man didn't answer. He simply turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows. When they closed the door, the air inside the room felt different, heavier, more oppressive. The temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Awais shivered. "This isn't normal. Why is it so cold?" Ali moved toward the thermostat on the wall. But as soon as he touched it, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a breeze brushing through leaves. But they grew louder, closer, forming indistinct words that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Who's there?" the protagonist called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a loud crash from the wardrobe. The door had flung itself open, revealing the empty interior, but something about it didn't feel empty. The darkness inside the wardrobe was different, deeper, as if it were a void rather than a simple wooden box. The friends stared at it, their fear mounting. Then, without warning, the wardrobe door slammed shut again with a force that shook the room. "That's it," Awais said, grabbing his jacket. "We're leaving. Right now." But as he moved toward the door, it slammed shut on its own. The sound reverberated through the room, and the whispers returned, now accompanied by a faint, eerie laugh. The laugh grew louder, more distinct, and seemed to move around the room, circling them. The friends huddled together, their backs to the wall, as their eyes darted around the dimly lit space. Then the window began to rattle violently. The fog outside seemed thicker now, pressing against the glass like a living thing. A shadow appeared behind the curtain, and this time it didn't vanish. The protagonist, heart pounding, moved cautiously toward the window. He pulled back the curtain and gasped. Outside, barely visible through the rain, was a figure standing still, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It was drenched, its clothes clinging to its emaciated frame. But the most horrifying detail was its face, or the lack of one. The figure had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface where its features should have been. The figure raised a hand slowly and pressed it against the glass. The fog seemed to part around its palm, revealing long, thin fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like nails. "Close it," Ali screamed, snapping the protagonist out of his trance. He yanked the curtain shut and stumbled back. The rattling stopped. But the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The old man's voice echoed in the protagonist's mind, "They don't like visitors." What did he mean? He muttered aloud, his voice trembling. Who doesn't like visitors? The spirits. Maybe? Ali suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. I've heard stories about places like this, about entities that attach themselves to people who intrude on their space. Great. A wise said sarcastically. We're being haunted by angry ghosts now. But his bravado faltered and the wardrobe creaked open again. Slower this time. The void inside seemed to expand, spilling cold air into the room. Then the lights flickered. And for a brief moment, the shadows on the walls moved independently of the flickering light. One of the shadows detached itself and slithered across the ceiling, its form elongating and shifting until it resembled a human shape. The shadow paused above them, its arms stretching out toward the group. Do something, Ali shouted. But none of them moved, paralyzed by fear. A sudden knock on the door snapped them out of their trance. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and impossibly loud. Ramesh opened the door cautiously. But the hallway was empty. Yet, just as he was about to close it, the old man appeared again, standing inches from the threshold. You stayed too long, he said, his voice dripping with urgency. They won't let you leave now. Before Ramesh could respond, the old man dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the faint scent of decay. The whispers returned, louder and angrier this time, and the shadows began to close in. The wardrobe door slammed shut once more. And this time, it didn't reopen. What do we do? A wise asked, his voice trembling. The protagonist took a deep breath, his mind racing. We leave, he said firmly. No matter what. We're getting out of here. The room felt alive now, pulsating with an oppressive energy that seemed to suffocate every breath. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more defined, their movements no longer bound by the flickering light. The air buzzed with an unnatural hum, growing louder with each passing second. We have to leave, the protagonist said, his voice strained with fear. Now. The friends didn't need convincing. Grabbing their jackets and bags, they moved toward the door. But as soon as Ramesh reached for the doorknob, it began to twist violently on its own. It's locked, he whispered, yanking at the handle. That's impossible, a wise exclaimed. It wasn't locked a minute ago. The whispers outside the door rose to a crescendo, mingling with faint footsteps that seemed to circle their room. The window began rattling again, the glass trembling as though something was pounding on it from the outside. Move, the protagonist shouted, grabbing a chair and slamming it against the door. The noise was deafening, but the door didn't budge. A loud crash echoed from behind them. They turned to see the wardrobe door had flung open again. But this time, the darkness inside seemed to spill out into the room like an inky mist. From the void, skeletal hands emerged, their fingers unnaturally long and clawed. Ali screamed, stumbling backward. What is that? The hands reached out, grasping at the air, pulling the shadows with them. One clawed hand swiped at Ramesh, narrowly missing his leg as he scrambled to the other side of the room. The mist spread rapidly, darkening the room and swallowing the faint light from the single bulb above. Within the mist, shapes began to form, human-like figures, twisted and grotesque. with gaping mouths and empty eyes. "They're everywhere," a wise yelled, clutching a Quran from his bag and reciting prayers under his breath. The figures moved closer, their forms flickering in and out of visibility like a malfunctioning projection. One reached for Ali, its fingers grazing his shoulder. He let out a blood-curdling scream as his skin turned ice-cold. "Don't stop moving," the protagonist shouted, pulling Ali away from the shadowy figure. With a final slam of the chair against the door, the lock broke, and the door burst open. The group spilled into the hallway, which was now bathed in an eerie red light. The once empty corridor was no longer quiet. The whispers were deafening here, accompanied by distorted laughter and disembodied screams. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some monstrous entity. The shadows followed them, slithering along the floor and walls, growing larger with each second. "Which way?" Ali asked, his voice shaking. "The stairs," Ramesh shouted, pointing to the staircase at the far end of the hallway. They sprinted toward it, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the staircase never getting closer. The shadows ahead of them shifted, coalescing into the form of the old man. "You shouldn't have stayed," he rasped, his voice echoing around them. He reached out a hand, and the floor beneath them cracked and splintered. Ramesh grabbed a wise just as the wood gave way, revealing a dark, gaping void below. From the darkness, hundreds of skeletal hands reached upward, clawing at the edges. "We'll jump over it," the protagonist yelled, leading the way. One by one, they leaped over the gap, the void below roaring with an unearthly sound. The group stumbled into the lobby, panting and desperate. The receptionist's desk was gone, replaced by a grotesque altar covered in dripping wax and charred bones. Above it hovered a figure, shrouded in mist and shadow, its form constantly shifting. "That's not possible," Ali muttered, his eyes wide with terror. The figure turned toward them, its hollow eyes burning with a sickly yellow light. It raised a hand, and the air around them seemed to compress. The friends fell to their knees, gasping for breath as the pressure grew unbearable. "Leave now," the figure intoned, its voice deep and guttural, "or you'll never leave at all." Summoning every ounce of courage, the protagonist grabbed a candelabra from the altar and hurled it at the figure. The shadow dissipated momentarily, and the pressure lifted. "Run," he shouted. They bolted for the front door, but the shadows weren't done with them. Tendrils of darkness lashed out from the walls, narrowly missing them as they darted through the lobby. The air was filled with a deafening cacophony of screams, laughter, and shattering glass. When they reached the parking lot, the rain had stopped, and their motorcycles stood eerily pristine, as if untouched. But the shadows loomed behind them, spilling out of the hotel like an unstoppable tide. "Get on the bikes," the protagonist yelled, fumbling with his keys. The motorcycles roared to life, and they sped down the driveway, the headlights cutting through the thick fog. Behind them, the hotel seemed to collapse in on itself, swallowed by the shadows. The laughter followed them, growing fainter as they rode further away. The protagonist grabbed a chair and hurled it at the figure, which dissolved into mist. The group bolted up the stairs, slamming the door to their room behind them. "We need to leave now," Ali said, his voice shaking. "But the bikes," Ramesh began. "Screw the bikes," a wise interrupted. "We're not staying another minute." The whispers intensified, and the wardrobe door creaked open on its own. The friends grabbed their belongings and made a dash for the exit. Ignoring the shadows clawing at the walls and the cold hands they felt brushing against their skin. When they reached the parking lot, their motorcycles were upright and dry, as if nothing had happened. Without questioning their luck, they mounted the bikes and sped away, the storm resuming the moment they left the hotel grounds. They didn't stop until they reached a small roadside cafe at dawn. As they sat sipping hot tea, trying to calm their nerves, they recounted the night's events. Out of curiosity, the protagonist asked the cafe owner about Hillcrest Lodge. The owner's face darkened. "That place burned down years ago," he said. "No one has stayed there since." The group exchanged horrified glances, their silence louder than any scream. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have stayed to confront the unknown? Or run at the first sign of danger? Let us know in the comments below. Story 3: The Spirit's Revenge. The night in the quiet village of Kashmir was unusually dark. The kind that seemed to swallow even the faintest starlight. Two sisters, Atiya and Farah, were left alone in their old mud brick house as their parents attended a family gathering in a neighboring town. It was supposed to be an uneventful night, just the two of them in the comfort of their home, surrounded by the silence of the rural landscape. But silence, they would soon learn, could be more terrifying than any noise. As the clock struck midnight, strange things began to happen. Faint knocks on the gate, shadows moving just beyond the window, and a voice, a chilling, disembodied voice, that called Atiya by name. What started as an ordinary evening would unravel into a night of terror and revelations about a long-buried family secret. Alone in a quiet, desolate house, the sisters were about to uncover a chilling secret buried deep within their family. The village of Kashmir was small and remote, a place untouched by time. Its narrow dirt roads were lined with houses built from mud and straw, their cracked walls standing as silent witnesses to generations of life. By day, the village was bustling with chatter and the sound of children playing. But by night, an oppressive silence descended, broken only by the occasional howling of stray dogs or the rustling of wind through the fields. Atiya and Farah's home stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by sprawling farmland. The house was modest but sturdy, with a single story, a small courtyard, and a well out back that had long since dried up. The sisters had spent countless evenings here alone. But this night felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that neither of them could quite place. The dim glow of a kerosene lamp illuminated the living room as the sisters sat cross-legged on a rug, scrolling through their phones. The light cast long shadows on the walls, making the house feel larger and emptier than it was. Outside, the darkness was impenetrable, and the village seemed to hold its breath. "Do you think they'll be back before morning?" Atiya asked, breaking the silence. Farah shrugged. "You know how these family gatherings go. They'll probably stay the night." Atiya nodded. But the unease lingered. The first knock came just past midnight. It was faint but deliberate. A slow, rhythmic tapping on the iron gate at the front of the house. Atiya and Farah froze, their eyes meeting in silent question. "Did you hear that?" Atiya whispered. Farah nodded, her expression uneasy. "Probably just the wind," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Then, it came again, louder this time. Atiya stood, her heart pounding. and moved toward the window that overlooked the gate. Peering through the curtain, she saw nothing but the shadowy outlines of trees swaying in the breeze. "There's no one there," she said, her voice trembling. Before Farah could respond, a low, raspy voice called out from the darkness. "Atiya." The sisters stared at each other, their fear palpable. "Did you hear that?" Atiya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Farah nodded. "It said your name." Atiya's breath hitched. "But, there's no one out there." The voice came again. This time closer. "Atiya, come outside." The kerosene lamp flickered as if reacting to an invisible gust of wind. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements erratic and unsettling. Atiya backed away from the window, her pulse racing. "We're locking the door," Farah said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She bolted the wooden door and grabbed a heavy metal rod from the corner of the room, clutching it like a weapon. As they huddled in the living room, the atmosphere grew heavier. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every rustle outside a potential threat. Then, the sound of shuffling feet echoed from the courtyard. Farah's grip tightened on the rod. "Whoever it is, they're inside now," she whispered. Atiya shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It can't be, the gate's locked." The shuffling stopped, replaced by a loud crash from the kitchen. Pots and pans clattered to the floor as if someone, or something, was rummaging through them. The sisters clung to each other, too terrified to move. The voice returned, now inside the house. "Atiya, I see you." Farah grabbed the lamp and turned toward the kitchen, but the light barely penetrated the darkness. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the corner of the room, they saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, staring at them through the shadows. The glowing eyes vanished, but the air in the room grew colder. The sisters could see their breath now, each exhale forming a misty cloud. The lamp flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Atiya fumbled for her phone, turning on its flashlight. The narrow beam of light revealed overturned furniture and scattered belongings, but no sign of the glowing eyes. Just as they thought the worst had passed, Atiya felt it, a cold, invisible hand gripping her arm. She screamed, pulling away, but the sensation lingered, like frost biting into her skin. "It's trying to hurt us," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Farah began reciting prayers aloud, her voice shaking but steady. The house seemed to react violently. The walls trembled, and a loud banging echoed through the rooms, as if someone were hammering from the inside. The sisters moved toward the front door, but as they reached it, it flung open on its own. Standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure, its outline human but its features indistinct. The figure stepped forward, and the voice spoke again, now louder and angrier. "You cannot escape me." Idris's form flickered like a candle flame in a violent wind, his hollow eyes locking onto the sisters as if piercing straight through to their souls. The room seemed to constrict around them, the walls trembled, and the floor beneath them groaned as if ready to collapse. The air was thick with malice, making it hard to breathe. "I warned your father," Idris growled, his voice echoing unnaturally. "I begged for mercy, and he gave me death. Now, I will take what he values most, his bloodline." Atiya's heart raced as the temperature in the room plummeted further, her breath visible in the icy air. "Farah, clutching Atiya's hand, began reciting a prayer under her breath. But her voice wavered with fear. "You think your prayers will save you?" Idris sneered, his figure swelling with each passing moment. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, forming clawed shapes that stretched toward the sisters. Atiya grabbed Farah's arm, pulling her back as the tendrils of shadow crept closer. "We can't stay here," she cried. "He's too strong." The sisters scrambled toward the front door, their bare feet slipping on the cold stone floor. But as they reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, shaking the entire house. Idris's laughter filled the room, low and menacing. "Where will you go?" he taunted, his voice reverberating through the walls. "This house is mine. You are mine." The windows rattled violently, the glass cracking but refusing to shatter. The kerosene lamp overturned, spilling its oil and igniting a small flame that flickered ominously in the corner. Shadows danced wildly across the walls, creating monstrous shapes that seemed to reach for the sisters. "Farah. The well." Atiya gasped, her mind racing. "He said they buried him in the well. Maybe we can go to the well?" Idris interrupted, his form appearing suddenly in front of them, blocking their path. His face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Do you wish to see where your father's sins lie buried? Do you wish to join me there?" Farah's grip tightened on Atiya's arm. "We can't let him win," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Keep praying." The sisters fell to their knees, their voices rising together in prayer. Atiya's words stumbled at first, her fear overwhelming her. But she forced herself to focus. The room grew even colder, the oppressive weight pressing down on them as Idris loomed above. "You think your God will save you?" Idris snarled, his shadowy form twisting into something monstrous, his once human face elongated into a grotesque, skeletal visage, and his clawed hands stretched impossibly long, reaching for the sisters. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Farah's legs and pulling her toward the center of the room. She screamed, gripping Atiya's hand with all her strength. "Let her go!" Atiya shouted, her voice breaking. She reached for the Quran on the nearby table, clutching it tightly. "You have no power here. Leave us alone." As she held the Quran aloft, its presence seemed to repel the shadows, which recoiled as if burned. Idris roared in anger, the sound shaking the very foundation of the house. Summoning all her courage, Atiya dragged Farah toward the back door, which led to the courtyard where the old, unused well stood. The air was thick with tension, every step feeling like a battle against an invisible force. The well loomed ahead, its stone edges crumbling with age. Dark moss clung to its surface, and the faint scent of decay wafted from its depths. As they approached, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "This is where it happened." Idris's voice echoed, though his form was no longer visible. "This is where your father betrayed me. My blood stains these stones, and my soul rots beneath them." Farah clutched Atiya's arm. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice quaking. Atiya looked down into the well, its depths obscured by an unnatural darkness. "We confront him," she said, though her own voice shook with uncertainty. "We have to end this." She knelt by the edge of the well and began reciting verses from the Quran, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. Farah joined her, their voices weaving together into a desperate plea for protection. The well seemed to react. The ground around it trembled. And a low, guttural growl rose from its depths. Shadows began pouring out, writhing and clawing at the sisters. But the light from their prayers pushed them back. From the well, Idris's form emerged, larger and more terrifying than before. His skeletal body was cloaked in swirling shadows, and his eyes burned with a fiery hatred. "You cannot banish me," he roared, his voice shaking the earth. "I was wronged. I demand justice." "This isn't justice," Atiya shouted back, standing her ground despite the tears streaming down her face. "You want revenge, but it won't bring you peace." Idris lunged at them, but the Quran in Atiya's hands glowed with a faint, golden light, forcing him back. The shadows around him writhed in agony, their shapes dissolving into mist. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice filled with both rage and sorrow. "Tell your father he cannot escape me. His sins will find him." With one final, ear-piercing scream, Idris's form shattered into fragments of shadow, which were drawn back into the well. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. The sisters collapsed to the ground, their breaths ragged. The house, though quiet now, still felt charged with the memory of what had just occurred. When their parents returned at dawn, the sisters recounted everything. Their father listened in silence, his face ashen. When they mentioned the well and Idris's accusations, he buried his face in his hands. "It's true," he admitted, his voice choked with guilt. "We thought we could bury the past. But I was wrong." He took the sisters to the mosque, where the imam performed prayers for their protection and gave them amulets to ward off evil. Though the activity ceased, the house never felt the same. Atiya and Farah avoided the well, and their father, once so confident, carried the weight of Idris's words like a curse. Would you have confronted Idris, or fled the house to save yourself? Do you believe spirits like Idris can find peace, or are they doomed to haunt forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The sisters sat huddled on the floor until dawn, too afraid to move. When their parents returned later that morning, Atiya and Farah recounted everything, their voices shaking with residual fear. Their father's face darkened as they spoke. When they mentioned the name Idris, he looked away, shame etched into his features. "It's true," he admitted finally. "Years ago, Idris came to us for help. We betrayed him. He didn't deserve what we did. And now he's come back for revenge." He instructed the sisters to visit the mosque immediately, where the imam gave them protective amulets and performed prayers for their safety. Though the activity ceased, Atiya and Farah could never shake the feeling of being watched. Even as years passed, the memory of that night haunted them. And the well behind the house remained untouched, a silent reminder of the secret that had nearly destroyed their family. What would you do if a long-buried family secret came back to haunt you? Do you believe spirits can seek revenge? Or was it something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The first light of dawn crept through the village, casting long shadows over the old mud brick house. Atiya and Farah sat huddled together in the living room, their faces pale and their eyes red-rimmed from the night's horrors. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made them flinch. Though Idris's form had vanished into the well, his words still echoed in their minds. "Tell your father, I will be back." When their parents finally arrived, the sisters rushed to explain everything. The urgency in their voices was enough to silence their father's usual dismissive attitude. But as they described the shadowy figure, the glowing eyes, and the accusation of murder, his face grew grim. When they mentioned Idris's name, his expression hardened into one of shame. "Idris," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I hoped he would never return." Their father admitted the truth, his voice heavy with regret. Years ago, he and his brothers had betrayed Idris, a trusted friend who had come to them for help. Out of greed or fear, he wouldn't say which, they had ended his life and buried him in the well, thinking the secret would die with him. But secrets, as the sisters learned, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Atiya and Farah listened in stunned silence, their world shaken by the revelation. The well they had played near as children was not just a dried-up relic but a grave. The father they had trusted carried the weight of a murder buried in their own backyard. "We need protection," their father said finally, his voice trembling. "Idris won't stop here. He's too powerful now." The family visited the village mosque, where the imam listened carefully to their story. He performed prayers and gave each family member an amulet to wear, promising that it would shield them from further harm. But even with the imam's reassurances, the sisters couldn't shake the feeling that Idris's vengeance was far from over. The well remained untouched, a silent reminder of the sins of the past. No one dared approach it, and the courtyard felt colder, darker, as if the land itself carried Idris's lingering anger. The sisters returned to their routines, but nothing felt normal anymore. Shadows seemed longer, darker, and every whisper of the wind felt like Idris calling out to them. Their father's guilt hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of what they had endured. Atiya often stared at the well from her bedroom window, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Was Idris truly gone? Or was he waiting for the right moment to strike again? Could a spirit so consumed by vengeance ever find peace? Farah, meanwhile, took to wearing her amulet even in sleep, her prayers more frequent and fervent than ever. She couldn't help but feel that Idris's warning wasn't just for their father, it was for all of them. As the camera pans away from the sisters' house, the well sits in the courtyard, its shadow stretching ominously across the ground. The wind picks up, carrying with it a faint whisper. "I'm still here." Viewers are left with an unsettling thought: was this really the end of Idris's story? Or merely the beginning of something far worse? "Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey," the narrator says, their voice steady yet tinged with suspense. Stories like these remind us that the past has a way of creeping into the present, and that some secrets refuse to stay buried. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, don't forget to hit the like button, it helps us bring you more chilling stories. And if you're brave enough to hear what comes next, subscribe to Wolf Tells and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss a single haunting tale. The narrator's voice grows softer, more conspiratorial. But before you go, let me ask you this: do you think spirits like Idris can ever find peace? Or are they doomed to wander, searching for vengeance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your theories. As the screen fades to black, the channel's name, Wolf Tells, appears in bold, crimson letters, accompanied by the faint sound of a ghostly whisper. The video ends, leaving viewers eager for the next spine-chilling tale.